We are united. Nobody can scare us, and our strength is in unity. We will resist any enemy, and our country and our city will follow the path predetermined by fate and God. We are sure that we will be victorious.
A world mourns in solidarity after an explosion in St. Petersburg claims the lives of Russian civilians. Could this be backlash for Russia's military actions in Syria and Iraq? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Russian investigators have identified Anton Fedyashin as the man behind the St. Petersburg metro blast. Investigators believe the 22-year-old detonated the bomb inside a metro carriage, killing at least 14 people and injuring dozens more. Julia Lyubova reports from the scene in St. Petersburg.
People are laying flowers day and night in St. Petersburg to remember those who were killed in a bomb blast on Monday.
I was scared and worried. I couldn't calm down. I was worried about my relatives who were coming back from work, university, and school.
I felt so sorry for the innocent people who died for nothing. Ordinary Russian people suffered because of terrorism, because of hate.
The explosion occurred at about 2:30 p.m. local time as the train left Sinai Square towards the Technological Institute station. The carriage door was blown off, and witnesses described seeing injured passengers with bloodied and blackened bodies. The attack was condemned worldwide. Chinese President Xi Jinping sent a telegram to Vladimir Putin expressing his condolences. Foreign diplomats paid their respects to the victims in St. Petersburg on Tuesday.
I am convinced that the solidarity we've seen not only from our CIS allies, but from almost all other world states, reflects common understanding that we need to finally join efforts, instead of trying to use this or that extremist group to reach narrow geopolitical goals.
Russia's investigative committee named Anton Fedyashin as the man behind the blast. His genetic traces were found on a bag containing an explosive device. The 22-year-old was born in Kyrgyzstan and had obtained Russian citizenship. The investigators said he planted a second bomb at a different metro station that did not explode. For many years, Russia suffered frequent terrorist attacks from radical Islamist groups in the North Caucasus. But since 2015, Russia has been on alert after ISIL had repeatedly threatened revenge for its military intervention in Syria and has been linked to recent bombings elsewhere in Europe. However, the investigation is still on, as it hasn't been confirmed which group was behind this attack. Julia Lyubova, CGTN, St. Petersburg.
Here now with us to discuss the attack and Russia's response is Simon Saradzhyan out of Boston. Simon is the founding director of the Russia Matters Project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Aurel Braun joins us from Toronto. Aurel is a professor of international affairs at the University of Toronto. Here with us in Washington is Anton Fedyashin, professor of Russian history at American University and author of Liberals Under Autocracy. And from Berkeley, we're joined by Steve Fish. He is a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Simon, let me start with you. From what we know so far, are there any indications of what the motive for this attack was and whether this was carried out by a lone wolf or perhaps was there a group, a radical group behind it?
Well, it's difficult to say with certainty what was the motive of the individual who allegedly detonated one bomb and failed to detonate another. But overall, the evidence we've been given so far allows me to assess that he was perhaps motivated by the grievances he had developed vis-à-vis Russia related to Russia's handling of the situation in Syria and so on and so forth, because where he was born, the Osh Valley, is a place where there's significant tension between ethnic Uzbeks and Kyrgyz. And yes, there's a certain amount of what political scientists call relative socioeconomic deprivation there, but Russia is not to be blamed for either of that. So the fact that he chose to target innocent Russian nationals in this attack makes me think that he perhaps was trying to avenge what he saw was unfair treatment of fellow Sunnis in parts of the world where Russia is involved militarily, such as Syria.
Aurel Braun, this is the latest in a long line of attacks in Russia against Russians. How have Russian security forces handled these threats and attacks before?
They reacted very harshly before. They moved quickly. They used specialized forces like Spetsnaz. There had been a loss of life when there were hostages taken. We know what happened at Beslan and in the case of the attack on the Moscow theater. But there has been a period of quiet, so perhaps they have been lulled into a false sense of security. And what is very significant about this event, this very tragic event, is that it took place in St. Petersburg, which seemed to be immune from an attack until now. It is the hometown of President Putin, and he happened to be visiting that day. So this sends a kind of message that the president of Russia, who has portrayed himself as a winning strategist, is not invincible.
Steve, does Russia, in a sense, face the same problem that many countries in Western Europe face, that there are young people in these countries who become radicalized on the internet, then leave, go to the Middle East, and now they return and carry out these attacks? Is that the kind of thing we're seeing in Russia right now?
That is the kind of thing we're seeing, although not on the scale that you have in Western Europe. You don't get as much movement of these radicalized extremists from Russia to the Middle East and then back to Russia as you have in Europe. But some of that could be going on right now. You know, the guy who actually committed this atrocity could be motivated by a number of things. It might be resentment against the Russian government for supporting the Assad regime, which is despised by most Sunni Muslims around the world, in Syria. Or it just could be have something more to do with local conditions in Russia. I don't think we really know that for sure yet.
Anton, what's your view on this? Do you see a connection, a clear connection between the terror threats and attacks that Russia faces and the Russian onslaught against ISIL in Syria?
It's certainly a potential, but let's remember that we literally know nothing about the Jalilov's motivations. Look, we have another example of the Tsarnaev brothers who bombed the Boston Marathon, who could not have possibly had any grievances against the United States that gave them a home, and yet they perpetrated an abominable act. It is impossible to predict what's behind this act. The two novelties that I find particularly concerning are A, St. Petersburg as a target. We don't know if he knew that President Putin was there. I seriously doubt it. But St. Petersburg had not been targeted before. Number two, this young man did not come from the Northern Caucasus, which Russians are used to seeing as the source of instability. So there seems to be no ethnic component to this. This young man seems to have been, to the best of our knowledge, radicalized online. We don't know if he traveled to the Middle East, but it would have come out by now if he had. So this is homegrown, and this is a new scenario for Russia.
Great point you make there about this taking place in St. Petersburg. And as you point out, St. Petersburg is the hometown of President Putin. He was born there, he was educated there, he entered politics in St. Petersburg. Was this a message perhaps to him?
I'm not sure. Again, it's very difficult to say. I think that the target was chosen by the young man because he spent his 6 years since he had been naturalized. Again, according to the information that the Russians have released, when he was 16, he lived in St. Petersburg. The security arrangements in that town are not as stringent as they are in Moscow. It's a softer target. But again, we know nothing about the background of all of this. What we do know is is that this is a reminder that international terrorism is a threat all over Europe. And if you put together the attacks that have happened, most recently in London and then in Paris before, then in Germany, in the United States, there's a clear tendency to target societies by lone wolves that are very difficult to predict and to trace. Networks need to be created on an international level. The Russians, to give them credit, have been calling for that consistently. And unfortunately, it's in the nature of intelligence services to serve their governments and to be closed off institutionally. So it's always an ongoing effort to get them to talk to each other and to share information. But that's the effort that needs to be made by the international community, East and West.
Simon, of course, the Russians are fighting their own war on terrorism. And as Aurel Braun pointed out just a moment ago, there's been a long period when there have not been any attacks in Russia. Now we have this attack. How would you assess the Russian effort in fighting terrorism?
Well, I would say that under Vladimir Putin, this effort has been more effective than under his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin. And if we count the period during which Dmitry Medvedev was the president, again, that was more successful. Overall, the Russian state capabilities have strengthened as the economy has rebounded, and after almost a decade of consecutive growth, President Putin had more funds at his discretion to strengthen the law enforcement and security community to fight terrorism. And the fruit of it could be seen after the end of the active phase of the Second Chechen War, when the number of terrorist attacks per se came down. But then it went up in around 2010, but then it petered out and went down. And now we are seeing a trend since 2015 at least, when the number of people convicted of terrorist attacks is increasing again. I think the number of people convicted of terrorism in Russia, according to Supreme Court statistics, exceeded 70 in the first half of 2016, which is more than for the entire year of 2015, when there were about 65 people convicted. Now, the factors that influence the level of terrorism in Russia is not only government sanctions per se, but also external factors such as the situation in Syria and Iraq. We shouldn't ignore the fact that several thousand Russian nationals and nationals of Central Asian republics have left their home countries to go fight on the side of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Syria. So that, in a sense, they saw that as a real opportunity to build a caliphate. So they flocked there while paying less attention to Russia. So the combination of factors has allowed Vladimir Putin to bring the levels of terrorism to a low level. And in fact, we've seen this lull in the number of attacks. But as the situation in the Middle East changes, chances are that some of these people would come back and target Russia, unfortunately.
Aurel Braun, looking at those figures that Simon was just citing there a moment ago, there was a report in the Washington political newspaper Politico which says that Russia is fast replacing the United States as the #1 enemy of Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and other Sunni jihadist groups. Do you think that's a fair assessment? It's something that we don't hear about very often.
Well, clearly, Russia has a problem with terrorism. It has had one for a long time. Mr. Putin has made his reputation by fighting terrorism. He has also tried to project the image of a very powerful and successful international leader who has managed to keep in power the Assad regime, despite American efforts to oust that government. And he wants to preserve that image. What is curious to me is how little has come out. It's almost as if the authorities are holding back information, because I think it would be very deleterious to the image of the president of Russia if this was viewed as blowback, if this turns out to have been an action which was retaliation for Russian involvement in Syria. There is considerable unhappiness in some quarters in Russia about Russian military actions abroad that cost a lot of money. And if there is this additional cost, and don't forget that we also have seen protests against corruption, the economy is doing poorly, there are significant problems that the government is facing. And I also wonder what ultimately will be the reaction, what kind of measures is the Russian government going to take? Will they introduce more repression against various groups inside Russia? Will they try to be more accommodating? Highly unlikely. So this is a complex and nuanced situation where information either is not available or is being withheld.